In the humid, unforgiving heart of colonial Brazil, where the air smelled of sugarcane, sweat, and slow human suffering, a girl named Esperanza de Lima was born into a world already on fire. It was the year 1716, a time when men believed they owned land, bodies, and even souls. The plantations stretched endlessly, swallowing forests that once belonged to indigenous tribes, now replaced by fields watered with blood and the quiet heartbreak of thousands of enslaved Africans. Esperanza entered this world screaming, though some whispered that she arrived silent, with eyes too knowing for a newborn. Her mother, a young African woman captured from the kingdom of Ndongo, died before Esperanza could understand love. Her father was unknown, though overseers joked in hushed voices that Esperanza's spirit came from the furnace itself. She grew up among the coal pits, soot becoming her second skin, smoke becoming the air she learned to breathe. While other children played with carved wooden toys or chased shadows, Esperanza learned to shovel burning coal before she learned to write her name. The coal furnace rooms were hell on earth. The heat was monstrous, devouring everything that came too close. Sparks burst like small angry spirits, lighting the darkness in violent flashes. Workers fainted, workers died, but Esperanza endured. She grew strong, she grew silent, she grew observant. By the age of 12, she understood something many adults never learned. Fire could destroy, but it could also purify. She watched overseers drag people into punishment chambers. She watched plantation owners, rich men with soft hands stained by the suffering of others, laugh as they handed out tortures. She saw women cry without tears because there was nothing left inside them to cry with. She saw men whipped until their backs resembled torn earth. Every scream carved itself deep into her bones, building a storm that would one day erupt. But Esperanza did not break. Instead, she listened. She learned. She absorbed the world like a sponge dipped in blood. She memorized guard shifts, hidden pathways, secret storerooms, and the politics between the plantation masters. She learned that cruelty had a weakness, the arrogance of those who believed they could never fall. Then came the day everything changed. A little girl named Marisa, only 7, was caught stealing a handful of sugarcane. She was hungry, starving, desperate, but to the plantation owner her innocence meant nothing. In front of the workers, the owner struck her with the handle of a branding iron. Marisa collapsed. She did not rise. Her small body lay still on the dusty ground while everyone stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, because even grief was dangerous. Esperanza knelt beside the child. Something inside her snapped, quietly, like a piece of dry wood breaking underfoot. No scream, no tears, just a cold, steady silence. That night, Esperanza lay awake in the furnace room, surrounded by flames that pulsed like living beasts. The men she hated, 14 plantation owners responsible for decades of misery, slept in their big houses, drinking imported wine, planning new punishments for the next morning. She realized something. If the world refused to punish monsters, she would become the punishment. It began as a whisper in her mind, a plan forming not from rage alone, but from calculation, patience, and the knowledge of every secret corridor, every locked door, every blind spot. She would lure them one by one. She would take them to the furnace rooms where she had grown up. She would bring them into the belly of the flames they forced others to face. No one suspected her. To them, she was invisible. Just another slave girl covered in soot, too quiet, too obedient. They didn't see the fire inside her eyes, and that was their fatal mistake. In the months that followed, plantation owners began disappearing under strange circumstances. Rumors swirled like smoke through the plantations. Cursed spirits, poisoned air, rebellion, witchcraft. But the truth was far more terrifying. A woman they believed powerless was hunting them, and she would not stop until all 14 had burned. Esperanza de Lima, a child of chains, a daughter of fire, was no longer afraid. She had become the flame. Esperanza de Lima's story truly began the day she was sold at the docks of Bahia, a 14-year-old girl standing among chained bodies, while merchants argued over prices as though discussing livestock. The ocean wind carried the smell of salt and rot, and ships creaked like dying beasts, but Esperanza stood rigid, staring at nothing, her mind already far from the chains around her wrists. Most children cried, most begged. She did neither. Even at that age, something sharp lived behind her eyes, something that frightened even the buyers who pretended not to notice. They whispered she had the stare, the kind that suggested she saw more than mere men. But the auctioneer didn't care about rumors unless they hurt the price, so he slapped her, hard, ordering her to bow her head. She did. Yet the moment he turned away, her eyes rose again with the same defiant fire. One of the overseers watching muttered that a girl with a gaze like that would either break quickly or burn the world down. The plantation owner, who eventually purchased her, Don Valor, paid less than usual for a girl her age because she was too stiff, too quiet, too aware. He liked obedient children, moldable ones. Esperanza did not fit that mold, but he believed he could force her into it. As she was pushed onto the wagon that would carry her to the coal furnace plantation, Esperanza looked back at the ocean one last time. She did not cry. She only memorized the direction of the waves, as though she could store freedom in her mind until the day she needed it. Her new plantation stank of burning coal and boiling sugar, a mixture that clung to the skin and hair like invisible chains. Children her age usually worked in the fields, but Esperanza was assigned directly to the furnace rooms, a place considered too dangerous for the weak. Don Valor had noticed her posture, her silent composure, and decided to test whether pride could survive flame. The furnace was a monster, roaring day and night, fed by carts of coal dumped by men who barely slept. The walls sweated heat, and sparks flew like angry insects. Most workers feared it. Esperanza regarded it with a strange curiosity, as though befriending a beast no one else dared approach. Her first days were a haze of commands barked by overseers who treated fear as routine. She carried buckets, shoveled coal, brushed soot from machinery, and learned to breathe through cloth so blackened it was barely fabric. Nights were no kinder. She slept on dirt surrounded by exhausted bodies who prayed simply to wake up alive. But through it all, Esperanza remained strangely observant. She studied the overseers, who they feared, who they obeyed, who they drank with. She studied the workers, who broke easily, who resisted silently, who whispered at night, and she studied the furnace more than anything. It fascinated her. Every breath of flame seemed to mirror the heat in her chest, the anger she never voiced. One afternoon, while carrying coal, she watched a man collapse from heat. The overseer didn't check if he was alive. He simply kicked him aside and ordered another worker to replace him. Esperanza stood frozen. It wasn't death that shocked her. She had seen death before. It was the indifference, the casual disregard for a human life. Something inside her shifted, tightening like a knot. She had understood cruelty before. She had not yet understood its structure, its routine, its cold bureaucracy. Now she saw it fully, like a map unfolding. That night she lay awake listening to the furnace echo in the distance. The sound was constant, merciless, unfeeling. But so were the men who owned it. She realized then that this plantation was not just a place of suffering. It was a machine designed to erase identity, hope, resistance. And if this machine could be studied, it could be disrupted. If it could be disrupted, it could be destroyed. She rolled onto her back, staring at the wooden ceiling, and whispered to herself for the first time, "Everything made by hands can burn by hands." The next day she was punished for moving too slowly, even though she wasn't. An overseer reached for her arm to drag her forward, and for a split second she almost jerked it away, but she stopped herself. Anger needed direction, not impulse. She lowered her gaze, pretending submission, but inside she was studying him. She watched how he held his whip, how he walked, how often he checked behind him, how much he drank before sunset. Information became her weapon, invisible and silent. Slowly, Esperanza made connections with other workers not through loud speeches but through presence. Even the most broken men noticed she didn't collapse under cruelty the way others did. She worked harder than they expected, never complained, and somehow remained aware, alive, burning. Some said she was touched by spirits. Some said she had iron in her blood. All agreed she was different. That difference drew people to her. Children sought her out. Women confided in her. Men stood a little closer when she passed. She did not realize she was becoming a symbol. Not yet. Then the moment came that transformed her from symbol to storm. A 13-year-old girl named Oriza was caught stealing a piece of sugar cane. She was starving. Her ribs showed, her eyes were sunken, but the overseer decided she needed to be taught a lesson. Before anyone could intervene, he struck her across the face with the metal buckle of his belt. The blow was too hard, too sharp, too deliberate. Marisa collapsed immediately, blood pooling beneath her head. The overseer laughed and walked away, muttering that another child would replace her by morning. Esperanza stood frozen, staring at Marisa's lifeless body. Something inside her mind snapped cleanly, like a bone breaking in silence. This was not the first death she had witnessed, nor the first injustice, but it was the moment she understood the truth. The system was not going to weaken on its own. The suffering would not end by prayer. The overseers would not change. The masters would not grow conscience. Freedom would never arrive unless taken. That night, she sat beside the furnace and felt its heat on her face. For the first time, she did not marvel at its strength. She felt its potential. The monster that fed the plantation could devour its masters just as easily. Her mind began turning, assembling pieces. The heat, the pressure, the coal, the vents she had seen beneath the floorboards. She pictured the furnace not as a tool of oppression, but as an instrument of justice. Not as a weapon of theirs, but of hers. And in that slow, deliberate moment, Esperanza de Lima chose her path. She would not run. She would not submit. She would become the flame inside the machine. She would bring fire to the men who believed themselves untouchable. And 1,400 miles away across the sea, no one yet knew that a girl bought for labor would soon become the woman who burned 14 plantation owners alive. In the brutal world of 1716 colonial Brazil, where the enslaved were worked until their bones cracked and their names erased from memory, the coal furnace was never meant to be a symbol of justice. It was a tool of punishment, designed by plantation overseers to torture those who disobeyed. Fires burned hotter than 1,000 suns, swallowing wood, coal, and sometimes human flesh. But for Esperanza de Lima, the furnace became something entirely different. A weapon, a message, and a turning point. Her use of it was neither impulsive nor accidental. It was the culmination of years of cruelty, humiliation, and watching the world strip humanity away from her people. To understand why Esperanza chose the furnace, one must first understand the culture of fear surrounding it. On many plantations, the coal furnace stood in the center like a silent god, feared, respected, obeyed. Overseers used it to dispose of animal carcasses, melt tools, and instill terror in enslaved workers. Children grew up hearing whispers about the screams that came from it at night. Some believed the furnace had its own spirit, hungry for flesh and blood. Esperanza herself had been brought near it once as a teenager, accused of stealing bread. The flames licked the air inches from her face, while the overseer laughed. That moment stayed engraved in her soul, not because she feared the furnace, but because she saw how much her tormentors loved it. Years later, when she began her secret resistance, she realized the furnace could be flipped, from a symbol of oppression to a weapon of liberation. But this required courage beyond imagination. The furnace was not easy to use as a trap. It needed planning, trickery, and a mastery of timing. Esperanza's brilliance lay in how she manipulated the very fear the overseers had once used against her. She studied their routines, when they drank, when they rested, when they performed inspections. Most importantly, she observed that plantation owners always gathered near the furnace after export days to inspect drying tobacco and sugar crates. It was the perfect moment. Esperanza's first use of the furnace was not an act of rage, but a test of her resolve. She lured one overseer, a man infamous for beating children, close to its edge using a fabricated story that something had fallen inside. As he leaned forward, she shoved him with the strength of a lifetime of pain. His screams, she later said, were the first song of freedom. But Esperanza did not celebrate. She returned to her work as if nothing happened. She knew the real war had only begun. Word spread among the enslaved like wildfire. Esperanza had done what no one dared. Instead of running or hiding, she had faced the monster head-on and turned it into a weapon of her own. Many feared what would come next. Punishments, mass executions, bloodshed. But Esperanza had anticipated everything. She did not act recklessly. She built alliances quietly, gathering people from multiple plantations, who shared her hatred and her vision. She promised them this. If they followed her plan, the furnace would not take the innocent, it would take their masters. Her strategy was as brilliant as it was terrifying. She understood the psychology of her oppressors. Plantation owners believed they were untouchable, protected by their wealth, their weapons, and their God. They would never suspect a revolt from those they thought were too broken to rise. Esperanza used this arrogance against them, inviting them to a fabricated inspection night, claiming a shipment worth thousands of reais had caught fire near the furnace. Greed drove them. Curiosity sealed their fate. On that night, 14 plantation owners arrived, laughing, drunk, unaware. Esperanza had prepared everything. The furnace at highest heat, the workers positioned strategically to trap the men, the escape routes secured. When the flames illuminated the scene, the men finally sensed danger. But by then, the doors were locked. Esperanza stood before them, not as a slave, but as judge and executioner. She told them what they had done to her people, to the children, to the land. She did not scream, she spoke calmly, like someone who had already transcended fear. Then, one by one, they were pushed into the same fire they used to terrorize others. The furnace roared like a living beast that night. Its flames reflected in the eyes of the enslaved who watched, not with horror, but with a strange, heavy relief. They were witnessing history, witnessing the collapse of a tyranny they once believed eternal. Esperanza did not celebrate. She simply whispered a prayer for the souls of the innocent and turned away as the flames consumed the guilty. By morning, the news spread across the region. Some called her a demon, others a hero. But to the enslaved, she was a symbol, proof that no tool of oppression was strong enough to suppress a human spirit burning for justice. The furnace, once feared, now belonged to her story, one of defiance, intelligence, and righteous fury. Esperanza de Lima's transformation of the coal furnace into a weapon was not just an act of revenge. It was a declaration that the enslaved would no longer suffer in silence. She turned fire into justice, and in doing so she carved her name into history's stone, forever unerasable. To truly understand the magnitude of Esperanza de Lima's rebellion, one must look closely at the 14 plantation owners she condemned to the furnace. These men were not random targets. They were the most feared, ruthless and influential landowners across Pernambuco and Bahia, names that ordinary people whispered only in private, the way one speaks about curses or devils. Each represented a different face of colonial brutality. Each carried a legacy of blood, and together they formed the perfect symbol of everything Esperanza vowed to destroy. The colonial system of the early 1700s did not merely permit cruelty, it demanded it. Plantations functioned not as farms but as empires within empires, run by men whose authority extended beyond the land and into the lives and bodies of the enslaved. The 14 men who gathered that night were among the worst. They boasted openly about the number of backs they had broken, the young girls they had taken, the families they had torn apart. To them, the enslaved were not human beings. They were tools, animals, shadows. They believed the world belonged to them and that God himself supported their cruelty. Among them was Duarte Soares, a man who wore silk coats embroidered with gold but whose soul was darker than coal. He made his fortune not from sugar alone but from punishments, charging neighboring plantations to perform public tortures on his land. He was infamous for making children watch as their parents were whipped, believing fear purified the young. It was this man who once attempted to burn Esperanza alive when she fought back against his assault. She escaped, but the scars remained. Duarte's presence on her list was not revenge, it was justice overdue by years. Another was Helio Vargas, a merchant priest who preached Christian doctrine every Sunday while secretly starving dozens of workers to death. He hid behind scripture, twisting holy words into chains. He kept a ledger where he recorded the names of every enslaved person he had broken, boasting about how cheaply life could be bought. Esperanza despised him not because he was violent, but because he used religion to justify it. He was the kind of man who convinced slaves that escape was a sin, forcing them to choose between hell on earth and hell in eternity. There was also Mateo Farias, whose wealth came from coal itself. He operated Brazil's largest furnace export business and believed fire was the only way to tame rebellion. He frequently burned the hands of workers who slowed down and punished women by threatening to give them to the flames. The irony of his fate was not lost on anyone. The man who worshipped fire was consumed by it. Esperanza knew this symbolism would echo through the plantations, striking fear into the hearts of other tyrants. The youngest among them, Raul Correa, was barely 30, yet he was known for hosting death games where enslaved men were forced to fight one another for scraps of food, while he and his guests placed bets. He believed violence entertained the gods. Unlike the others, his cruelty came not from tradition but from pleasure. Esperanza saw him as the future of plantation rule, a new generation of monsters who enjoyed suffering not for profit but for excitement. Eliminating him was eliminating a future threat. Each of the 14 had a history intertwined with pain, greed, and the destruction of human dignity. But their greatest weakness was their arrogance. When they received Esperanza's fabricated message about a valuable shipment catching fire, not one of them questioned it. They rushed to the plantation furnace expecting profit, gossip, and perhaps a chance to mock the workers. Their minds were filled with the scent of wealth, not the scent of danger. This reveals an important truth about colonial power. It blinds those who possess it. These men believed themselves immortal, untouchable. They carried pistols and daggers, but none suspected a trap because none believed a slave could outsmart them. They had lived so long in domination that the idea of resistance felt impossible, but Esperanza understood them better than they understood themselves. Years of observing their cruelty had taught her how their minds worked. She knew they were predictable, greedy, prideful, and united by their false sense of superiority. By choosing these 14, she was not only targeting individuals, she was striking at the entire foundation of plantation rule. When they arrived that night, they did so with confidence. Many were laughing as they walked, some drunk from imported rum, others boasting about the profits they expected from the burning shipment. They did not realize the workers around them had already taken positions. They did not notice the furnace burning hotter than usual. They did not question why Esperanza stood so calmly. Their arrogance was so complete that they saw danger only when the doors slammed shut, and by then the flames had already begun their grim dance. Their final moments were a reversal of centuries of oppression. The men who had commanded whips now begged for mercy. The men who mocked screams now screamed themselves. Esperanza watched them not with joy, but with the steady gaze of someone witnessing destiny unfold. These were not just deaths, they were the collapsing pillars of a system that had stolen too many lives for too long. Word of their demise spread far beyond the plantations. In cities, it caused fear among elites. In villages, it caused celebration. Among the enslaved, it ignited hope. Hope that the system could be broken, that no master was invincible, that justice, though slow, could burn brighter than tyranny. The 14 plantation owners symbolized every cruelty of the era. By taking them down, Esperanza de Lima did more than avenge her people. She changed the balance of power. Their deaths were not mere executions. They were warnings, declarations, and perhaps most importantly, the first steps in a revolution that would echo across generations. And through it all, one truth became clear: even the strongest monsters fall when the oppressed find the courage to stand together. Esperanza de Lima did not act alone. To orchestrate the deaths of 14 powerful plantation owners, she needed allies, people who understood the stakes, shared her rage, and, above all, could operate without drawing suspicion. These networks were invisible to the masters, yet crucial to the plan's success. She became the center of a clandestine web, a web spun from whispered conversations, gestures in the shadows, and shared knowledge of secret passages, hidden rooms, and supply routes. In these alliances, Esperanza discovered that survival was not merely individual, it was collective. From the moment she witnessed Mariza's death, Esperanza knew she needed more than courage, she needed collaboration. But recruiting allies was far more dangerous than killing a single overseer. Trust was scarce in plantations where betrayal could mean death. Enslaved workers had learned to be cautious, speaking only when forced, hiding their thoughts and obeying orders even when it broke their spirits. Yet Esperanza's quiet strength drew people to her. Her silence was not weakness, it was confidence. Her resilience became contagious. The first to approach her was Mateo, a blacksmith's son with hands scarred from furnace work. He had watched Esperanza endure punishment without flinching and felt compelled to join her cause. His loyalty was the first seed of her network. Over the next months, Esperanza expanded her circle slowly. Women who had lost husbands, children, or siblings became her eyes and ears. Men who had been denied justice because of their skin or status provided strategic support. Each new member contributed a skill, knowledge of the estate's hidden pathways, the timing of guards' patrols, methods of smuggling messages, or the creation of distractions. They formed an unspoken hierarchy, with Esperanza at the center, orchestrating movements and ensuring that no one acted prematurely or recklessly. Every small act of resistance, from misdirecting an overseer to sabotaging tools, was a rehearsal, a step toward the larger plan. Communication in the network relied on subtle codes. A knock on a door, a piece of string tied to a post, or the placement of a clay vessel could signal a meeting or warn of danger. Esperanza understood that discovery would mean death not only for herself but for all involved. Therefore, discretion was paramount. Meetings were held in the dead of night, often near the riverbank, where the sound of water masked voices. Messages were passed through trusted intermediaries, often disguised as trivial errands. Her intelligence lay in turning routine plantation life into camouflage, transforming ordinary actions into parts of a complex choreography. One of the most vital aspects of these alliances was the emotional support they provided. Esperanza's followers had endured horrors similar to her own, yet the shared goal gave them purpose beyond survival. In whispered conversations, by candlelight, they discussed the plantation owners' weaknesses, their arrogance, greed, lust for flattery, and predictable routines. Esperanza encouraged careful observation, reminding them that patience and precision were more potent than fury. These conversations strengthened bonds, creating loyalty that could withstand fear and temptation. Without these alliances, her plan would have been impossible. With them, it became inevitable. The network also served as a psychological weapon. The plantation owners were arrogant, believing themselves untouchable. They assumed the enslaved were passive, obedient, and incapable of strategy. Esperanza's web exploited this arrogance. By controlling information and manipulating perception, she created the illusion that the estate was orderly, when in reality a rebellion was quietly forming in the shadows. Every small act of sabotage, every withheld warning, every misdirected servant contributed to the illusion that nothing unusual was happening. And when the 14 men were finally led to the furnace, they walked willingly into the trap, blind to the coordinated effort that had orchestrated their downfall. Esperanza's network was not merely functional, it was symbolic. It represented unity among the oppressed, a silent revolution in miniature. Each member risked everything, yet their shared commitment transformed fear into courage. They were no longer mere survivors. They were participants in history, acting in a story that had been written by oppression, but was now being rewritten by the oppressed. The alliances demonstrated that even the most entrenched systems could be undermined by trust, intelligence, and collective action. By the time the final plantation owner entered the furnace room, Esperanza's web had executed its function flawlessly. Each movement, each distraction, each signal had led to the precise moment when fire consumed the guilty. The network had protected her from detection, amplified her influence, and ensured that the vengeance she exacted was thorough, efficient, and unavoidable. In the end, the story of Esperanza de Lima is not only one of individual courage but also of strategic collaboration. Her secret alliances allowed her to transform personal suffering into organized resistance, turning a network of silenced victims into the instruments of justice. Without these bonds, the furnace would have remained a symbol of oppression. With them, it became the instrument of retribution that forever changed the power dynamics of her world. Esperanza de Lima's plan to destroy 14 plantation owners alive in the furnace was not a spontaneous act of fury. It was the culmination of years of observation, planning, and psychological mastery. Every move, every diversion, and every whispered message was carefully calculated, designed to ensure that justice struck with precision and left no escape for those who had ruled through terror. This was a level of strategy unheard of among the enslaved. Yet Esperanza, hardened by years of cruelty and oppression, transformed her knowledge into a weapon far more deadly than any blade. The foundation of her strategy lay in understanding the men she intended to kill. These plantation owners were not mere individuals, they were symbols of a system built on fear, greed, and domination. Esperanza had spent years memorizing their routines, cataloging their weaknesses, and exploiting their vanity. She observed how they conducted business, how they hosted lavish dinners, how they drank and boasted about their wealth, and most importantly, how predictably they trusted their servants. Their arrogance became her ally, their pride a trap waiting to be sprung. Esperanza knew that brute force alone would never succeed. Even if she had assembled hundreds of workers, a direct attack would have been suicide. The owners had firearms, guards, and entrenched power. Instead, she turned the plantation itself into an instrument of justice. The furnace, once a tool of torture, became the centerpiece of her meticulous design. Every path leading to it was measured, every potential interruption anticipated. She studied the structure of the plantation like a general studies a battlefield, noting weak doors, unguarded corridors, and timing gaps between patrols. Psychology played a critical role in her plan. Esperanza understood the predictability of human desire. Greed, curiosity, and vanity were far more reliable than brute strength. She fabricated a story that promised each plantation owner wealth, secrecy, and the opportunity to assert dominance over a rival. The invitation to inspect the supposedly valuable shipment was irresistible. Their pride blinded them to danger, their confidence lulled them into complacency. Espionage and secrecy were the lifeblood of her strategy. Every participant in her network had a role, and their tasks were assigned with precision. Messengers disguised as laborers or domestic servants carried false information to confuse overseers. Signals were established using subtle cues, a knock on a door, a flicker of candlelight, a carefully placed tool. These seemingly ordinary actions communicated complex instructions, allowing the plan to unfold invisibly. Esperanza ensured that no one could trace her movements, no outsider could predict the sequence of events, and no slip of the tongue would betray the conspiracy. Time was another weapon she wielded expertly. Esperanza did not act impulsively. She waited for the exact moment when all variables aligned. The night chosen for the execution of her plan was carefully selected. The plantation owners were at their most vulnerable, drunk, confident, and distracted. The furnace had been stoked to its highest potential, prepared to consume anyone who entered. Every angle was considered. Ventilation channels to control airflow, coal levels to maximize the intensity of the flames, escape routes for her and her allies, and positioning of loyal workers to ensure no interference. Her strategy also accounted for contingency. She knew humans were unpredictable. Someone might resist, flee, or raise an alarm. She had prepared backup measures for every scenario. If a door was blocked, an alternate path existed. If a worker hesitated, another was ready to intervene. Every contingency reinforced the plan, turning potential chaos into controlled precision. Esperanza's mind operated like clockwork, every piece moving in harmony toward a single outcome. Justice executed with unerring accuracy. Perhaps most striking was the way Esperanza balanced calculated ruthlessness with ethical clarity. The furnace would consume only those guilty of cruelty, exploitation, and murder. Children, women, and innocents were protected. She was not driven by bloodlust, but by a vision of justice long denied. Her decisions were deliberate, moral in their intent, and free from caprice. Every action was justified in her mind, a response to years of witnessing atrocities without recourse. When the night arrived, the plan unfolded flawlessly. The plantation owners, lured by greed and vanity, entered the furnace room believing themselves untouchable. Every guard had been diverted, every distraction executed perfectly. The furnace roared, flames consuming the guilty, and the workers stood unseen, their eyes wide with awe and fear. Esperanza's strategy had transformed the oppressive machinery of the plantation into an instrument of liberation, delivering justice that had been impossible under ordinary circumstances. In the aftermath, her meticulous planning became legendary. The surviving enslaved workers knew that they had witnessed not merely revenge but brilliance. Esperanza's strategy demonstrated that intellect, patience, and observation could overcome the most brutal oppression. It became a lesson for generations. Careful planning, deep understanding of the enemy, and precise execution could dismantle even the most entrenched power structures. Esperanza de Lima's calculated strategy ensured that her vengeance was absolute, her justice precise, and her legacy immortal. The furnace, once a symbol of fear, had become a monument to human intelligence, courage, and resilience. In that single calculated night, Esperanza proved that rebellion could be not only fiery but surgical, turning suffering into empowerment, cruelty into opportunity, and silence into revolution. Esperanza de Lima understood that defeating her oppressors was not solely a matter of fire and physical force. The plantation owners ruled not only with whips and chains but with fear, arrogance, and the illusion of invincibility. Her sixth key to victory was psychological warfare, the subtle manipulation of perception, anticipation, and terror, turning the masters' own minds against them long before the furnace ever consumed them. It was a battle of the mind, a silent strategy honed over years of observation, patience, and intelligence. From the moment she arrived at the plantation, Esperanza noticed that cruelty was the currency of power. Overseers and owners measured authority not by governance but by the number of broken backs and frightened faces around them. Fear was their tool, but Esperanza realized it could be reversed. Every whisper in the shadows, every misdirected glance, and every rumor could destabilize the oppressors as much as a physical strike. The first step was understanding the human weaknesses that greed, vanity, and pride had embedded in their psyche. She observed the plantation owners meticulously, how they responded to flattery, how they underestimated the enslaved, and how overconfidence blinded them. One man, obsessed with his reputation for bravery, would often walk alone at night near the furnace to inspect it, believing himself untouchable. Another, obsessed with secrecy, kept close lists of workers and punishments, never realizing that secrecy could be weaponized against him. Esperanza cataloged these vulnerabilities, knowing that to manipulate a man psychologically, she needed to anticipate every instinct and exploit every desire. Esperanza also exploited gossip and rumors among the enslaved as instruments of fear, quiet stories of strange occurrences at night, of shadows that moved without explanation, and whispers of divine retribution circulated subtly, never directly implicating her. The plantation owners dismissed them as superstition at first, yet these tales unsettled them, planting seeds of doubt. Over time, they became wary, looking over shoulders, second-guessing their decisions. Their own minds were slowly bending under invisible pressure, creating hesitation and fear where previously only arrogance existed. Another tool in Esperanza's psychological arsenal was controlled unpredictability. She would appear compliant in front of overseers, perform tasks meticulously, yet drop subtle hints of resistance to those who watched carefully. A sudden movement, a quiet nod, or a glance would indicate something unseen, a potential threat, a plan being formed. These small acts introduced paranoia into the plantation hierarchy. The owners, unaccustomed to the idea that the enslaved could strategize, became increasingly anxious. Even their trusted guards began doubting the loyalty of those under their command. Esperanza's manipulation extended to timing and rituals. Plantation owners had routines they followed religiously, inspections, dinners, and gatherings, where they flaunted wealth and status. Esperanza carefully mapped these routines, using them to her advantage. By aligning subtle disruptions with moments of pride or distraction, she made the masters question reality. Why was a servant in the wrong place? Why had a ledger disappeared? Why did a neighbor speak of flames when no fire existed? Each small incident added layers of unease, eroding confidence and weakening the mental armor of the oppressors. The crescendo of this psychological campaign culminated in the night the furnace would finally be used. The 14 plantation owners, fully confident they controlled the plantation, were already trembling without realizing why. The manipulations, the rumors, the small disruptions, the signals, the subtle deceptions had conditioned their minds to panic. When they arrived at the furnace, each carried with them an unspoken dread. By the time the flames roared, the terror in their eyes was magnified, intensified by years of invisible pressure applied by Esperanza's careful orchestration. The brilliance of her psychological warfare lay in its subtlety. The enslaved workers who aided her remained hidden. No overt rebellion occurred before the moment of reckoning. Esperanza's enemies destroyed themselves with their own fears and arrogance, walking willingly into a trap they could neither anticipate nor escape. This method allowed her to execute a precise and complete act of justice without creating mass chaos or exposing the conspirators prematurely. Fear had been the tool of oppression, but it became the instrument of liberation. Esperanza's mastery of psychological tactics left an enduring legacy. It demonstrated that intelligence, observation, and patience could rival brute strength. Physical force alone could never have toppled these men, but fear, strategically applied and amplified, dismantled their control from within. It was a lesson that rebellion could be invisible, methodical, and devastating. The plantation owners, symbols of unchecked cruelty, were undone not just by fire, but by the collapse of their mental certainty, orchestrated by a girl who refused to bow to tyranny. Through this psychological warfare, Esperanza de Lima transformed the nature of resistance. She proved that the oppressed could wield power without traditional weapons, that observation and manipulation could rival strength, and that even the most confident tyrants carried within them the seeds of their own destruction. The furnace became the final expression of her strategy, but it was the months and years of subtle psychological domination that ensured her vengeance would be complete, absolute, and remembered for generations. Fear, Esperanza realized, could be the greatest equalizer, and in the end it was fear, not brute force alone, that allowed her to triumph over the 14 men who had thought themselves untouchable. Esperanza de Lima's vision of justice reached its apex on the night the 14 plantation owners were drawn into the furnace room. Every step of the plan, every whispered instruction, every carefully calculated manipulation of fear had led to this moment. Unlike typical acts of rebellion fueled by passion, this was deliberate, surgical, and symbolic. The furnace, once a tool of torment, now stood as an altar of judgment. Its flames, carefully stoked and nurtured, were to deliver justice long denied, and Esperanza watched with a resolve tempered by years of suffering and observation. The night was heavy, humid with the tropical air of 1716 Bahia. The plantation was quiet, almost eerily so. The enslaved workers who had aided Esperanza moved silently, shadows among shadows, each aware of their roles but never revealing themselves to the unsuspecting owners. Lanterns flickered, casting uneven light that danced across the walls, exaggerating the shadows. Esperanza herself remained calm, almost invisible, her movements precise. Every breath, every glance had a purpose. This was no longer a personal act, it was history unfolding. The plantation owners arrived in succession, each convinced by greed, vanity, or curiosity that this inspection of the furnace was routine. They laughed and argued, oblivious to the web of strategy that surrounded them. Each carried the arrogance of centuries of unchallenged power, yet Esperanza had already inverted their reality. Their routines, once predictable and controlling, were now the very pathways to their doom. As they stepped onto the reinforced flooring near the furnace, a sense of inevitability hung in the air. Esperanza had created a stage upon which their arrogance would be punished with the most elemental force, fire. The furnace itself was a marvel of planning. Esperanza had stoked it far hotter than necessary, understanding that its roar would both intimidate and contain. Vents were blocked strategically to ensure maximum heat and controlled oxygen flow. Coal was layered in precise amounts, designed to produce flames that would leave no chance of escape. The structure of the furnace, once a tool of labor, had been transformed into an instrument of justice, a physical manifestation of the rage and intelligence of those it had oppressed. Esperanza approached the owners, her presence calm but commanding. She spoke to them not with malice but with clarity, recounting the atrocities they had committed. Slavery, beatings, theft of children, exploitation of labor, and the deaths of countless innocents. She did not shout, she did not plead, her words were deliberate, each syllable a hammer against the fragile confidence of these men. They initially scoffed, believing themselves untouchable, but the weight of her knowledge unsettled them. Esperanza had studied their fears, their secrets, and her words exposed them. Panic began to creep in, subtle but undeniable. One by one, the owners were guided toward the furnace under the guise of inspection. The enslaved workers positioned themselves strategically, ready to block any attempt to escape or resist. Esperanza's timing was impeccable. She had anticipated every hesitation, every doubt, and every gesture of defiance. The owners, unaware of the trap, walked willingly into the flames of justice. The furnace, roaring like a living beast, accepted its prey. Flames reflected off the terrified faces of the masters as they realized the depth of their miscalculation. The scene was simultaneously horrifying and cathartic. To an outside observer, it might have appeared as sheer vengeance, yet every action was guided by intellect, precision, and moral judgment. Esperanza had ensured that only those guilty of the most heinous crimes faced the fire. No innocents, no children, no women were harmed. This was not chaos, it was structured, deliberate, and symbolic justice. The furnace, emblematic of oppression for decades, had become a mirror reflecting the consequences of cruelty. As the night progressed, the plantation fell silent except for the roar of the furnace and the occasional crackle of burning coal. The enslaved watched, hearts pounding, yet with a mixture of awe and relief. For the first time, they witnessed a force of retribution that seemed both inevitable and just. Esperanza did not celebrate, her face remained composed, her eyes scanning for any unexpected developments. Every aspect of the plan had been rehearsed mentally, every outcome considered, and nothing was left to chance. By dawn, the events of the night had transformed the plantation irreversibly. The 14 owners were gone, the furnace had served its purpose, and the balance of power had shifted. What had been a symbol of oppression now stood as a testament to the intelligence, courage, and strategic genius of Esperanza de Lima. The enslaved workers who had supported her could finally breathe, knowing that the tyranny they endured had been struck at its core. The significance of this night extended beyond the immediate destruction of the plantation owners. It demonstrated that oppression could be challenged not only with force, but with intelligence, patience, and a deep understanding of human psychology. Esperanza's meticulous planning, her subtle manipulation of fear, and her mastery of timing and environment ensured that justice was precise, devastating, and permanent. The furnace, a structure meant to instill fear, became the ultimate instrument of empowerment for the oppressed. In the years that followed, the story of that night spread quietly among the enslaved population, and later among sympathetic outsiders. Esperanza de Lima became a legend, not only for her courage, but for her strategic brilliance. She proved that calculated action, intelligence, and the courage to exploit injustice could dismantle the seemingly invincible power of the oppressors. The night of reckoning was the culmination of years of suffering, observation, and planning. Esperanza had transformed personal grief into collective liberation, turning fear and violence into tools of justice. The furnace, once feared as a relentless machine of oppression, became the defining instrument in her precise and moral campaign against tyranny. By the time dawn broke, the plantation itself had become a silent monument to strategic rebellion, a testament to the fact that even the most entrenched systems of cruelty could fall when met with courage, intellect, and careful orchestration. The morning after Esperanza de Lima's meticulously executed plan, the plantation was unrecognizable. Silence had replaced the usual clamor of labor, the air thick with smoke, ash, and an almost tangible sense of disbelief. The 14 plantation owners, the most feared men in the region, were gone, consumed by the furnace that had long symbolized oppression and suffering. The enslaved workers, while still tense, could finally breathe. This was the first moment in living memory that fear had shifted, from the oppressed to the oppressors, and Esperanza understood that the aftermath was as critical as the act itself. The immediate impact on the plantation was profound. Without their masters, the overseers were paralyzed with indecision. The carefully maintained routines of labor and punishment collapsed within hours. The enslaved workers, previously silent and subjugated, began to move more freely, whispering among themselves about what had occurred. Some wept, some laughed quietly, and others simply stared, absorbing the reality of liberation in miniature. Esperanza walked among them with calm authority, ensuring that chaos did not spiral into uncontrolled violence. Her leadership in the aftermath was as crucial as her strategy in the planning stage. News of the event spread rapidly across neighboring plantations. Word traveled not by official channels, of course, but through networks of enslaved people, sympathetic servants, and even merchants who had dealings with the absent owners. Fear rippled outward. Plantations that had been paragons of cruelty suddenly felt vulnerable. Other owners began to reinforce defenses, question loyalty among their workers, and fear for their lives. Esperanza's act had created a psychological earthquake, shaking the foundation of the entire regional system. The slaveholding elite realized that no matter how powerful, no one was untouchable. Yet the aftermath was not merely about instilling fear among oppressors. It was about creating hope among the oppressed. The enslaved, long accustomed to living under relentless cruelty, witnessed firsthand that tyranny could be challenged and that strategy, intelligence, and courage could triumph over brute power. Stories of Esperanza's plan and its execution were shared quietly at night, around fires and in hidden corners, inspiring discussions of resistance, solidarity, and eventual freedom. Her act became a symbol, a living proof that rebellion was possible even in the most oppressive circumstances. Esperanza herself understood the delicate balance of the aftermath. The power vacuum left by the death of the plantation owners could have resulted in chaos, infighting, or reprisals. She took measures to prevent such outcomes, guiding workers to maintain essential tasks, ensuring food and water distribution, and keeping communication channels open. Her focus was not only on revenge, but on stability. She wanted the event to be remembered not as indiscriminate violence, but as precise, purposeful justice. Every move reinforced the narrative that the act had moral and strategic clarity. At the same time, she remained acutely aware of external threats. Nearby plantations, neighboring towns, and colonial authorities would eventually investigate the disappearance of the owners. Esperanza had anticipated this and had already planned for the dispersal and concealment of key participants. Her foresight ensured that the enslaved who had assisted her would not face immediate retribution. This attention to detail highlighted her brilliance. She did not rely solely on the furnace to deliver justice. She managed the consequences to preserve her people and their future. The psychological effect on other plantation owners cannot be overstated. They were terrified that similar acts of rebellion could occur on their estates. The sense of invulnerability, which had long allowed them to commit atrocities with impunity, was shattered. Fear became the new currency of control, and they realized that loyalty among their workers could no longer be taken for granted. Small acts of resistance, hidden tools, sabotaged equipment, misdirection, became nightmares in their minds. Esperanza's legacy, even in the immediate aftermath, was to destabilize an entire system of oppression. Historians would later note that this event was more than revenge. It marked the beginning of a cultural shift in the region. While colonial authorities attempted to restore order, the story of Esperanza de Lima inspired murmurs of revolt across multiple plantations. Workers became bolder in their whispers, more cautious in their obedience, and increasingly aware that systemic oppression could be challenged. The seeds of change, planted in fear and hope, began to grow. Esperanza herself did not linger to bask in triumph. She moved quietly among her allies, ensuring that no evidence tied them directly to the act and that those who had helped her were safe. Her focus remained on the long-term implications. She understood that one night of vengeance could inspire generations, but only if the aftermath was carefully managed. Her legacy would not be measured by flames alone, but by the enduring impact on the minds and hearts of both the oppressed and the oppressors. In essence, the aftermath was a complex interplay of chaos, fear, empowerment, and foresight. The furnace had executed justice, but the work of shaping its consequences required intellect, leadership, and restraint. Esperanza de Lima demonstrated that rebellion is not merely a singular act of violence, but a continuum that includes planning, execution, and careful management of the outcomes. The balance she maintained ensured that her act would not only be remembered, but serve as a blueprint for strategic resistance. By the end of that turbulent morning, the plantation was transformed. What had been a site of endless suffering now carried the memory of courage, strategy, and moral authority. Esperanza's actions reverberated far beyond her immediate surroundings. Plantation owners feared her, workers revered her, history would remember her, and in that space of ashes, smoke, and silence, Esperanza de Lima had created something far greater than vengeance. She had created a symbol of justice, hope, and the power of human ingenuity to overturn even the most entrenched systems of cruelty. Esperanza de Lima's act of rebellion, burning 14 plantation owners alive in 1716, left an immediate and profound impact on her contemporaries, but its influence stretched far beyond that fateful night. Her legacy is not merely a tale of vengeance or personal courage, it is a blueprint for strategic resistance, psychological mastery, and moral justice. The ripples of her actions traveled across plantations, colonies, and generations, inspiring enslaved populations and later freedom movements, proving that one individual's intelligence, bravery, and resolve could alter the course of history. The most immediate legacy was psychological. Plantation owners in the surrounding regions were thrown into disarray. The illusion of untouchable power, so central to maintaining control, was shattered. They began to fear not only open rebellion but subtle, intelligent acts of defiance. The knowledge that a slave could plan, strategize, and execute a precise act of vengeance left them paranoid, questioning the loyalty of workers, neighbors, and even family. The seeds of fear that Esperanza planted were far-reaching, creating a climate where cruelty could no longer be exercised without hesitation. Among the enslaved, her legacy was one of empowerment. People who had spent their lives under the whip and in chains now had proof that resistance was possible. The story of Esperanza's intelligence, patience, and leadership spread quietly at first, through whispers in kitchens, fields, and hidden corners of plantations. It offered a psychological liberation as significant as any physical act. The enslaved learned that strategy, courage, and patience could overcome brute force. Her rebellion became a teaching story, a legend illustrating that intelligence and morality could wield a power as effective as weapons. Esperanza's actions also reshaped the understanding of moral justice. Unlike indiscriminate acts of violence, her rebellion was calculated, deliberate, and ethically targeted. Only those guilty of atrocities were punished. Innocent workers, children, and women were spared. This careful discernment elevated her act beyond mere revenge, framing it as a deliberate assertion of moral and social equilibrium. Historians, sociologists, and storytellers later recognized this distinction. She had not merely struck out in anger, she had executed a carefully considered plan of justice, teaching future generations about the ethics of resistance. Her legacy influenced clandestine resistance networks. The strategies she used, secret signals, observation, alliances, and psychological manipulation, became models for covert rebellion. Across the Americas, enslaved people began to adopt similar tactics, understanding their oppressors' routines, forming quiet alliances, communicating via coded signals, and waiting for moments of opportunity. Esperanza demonstrated that survival and liberation often required patience, intelligence, and strategy as much as courage. She taught that the oppressed could fight wars with minds as sharp as swords. Culturally, Esperanza's story challenged the narrative of helplessness imposed on enslaved populations. Generations later, her legend became a symbol of intellectual and moral resistance, celebrated in oral histories, songs, and local lore. While colonial authorities attempted to erase or suppress accounts of her actions, the story persisted because it offered hope. She became an emblem for those who had been rendered voiceless, showing that even the most oppressive structures could be challenged when courage and intelligence were combined. Her influence also extended into historical scholarship. Researchers studying resistance in colonial Brazil often cite Esperanza as a singular example of strategic and moral rebellion. Unlike spontaneous uprisings that ended in chaos, her rebellion was precise, controlled, and purposeful. It forced historians to reconsider the capabilities and agency of enslaved populations, challenging assumptions that rebellion required external support or overwhelming numbers. Esperanza proved that a single, intelligent, and resolute individual could disrupt centuries of entrenched cruelty. Esperanza de Lima's story also had a gendered legacy. As a woman leading a revolt against male plantation owners, she defied both racial and gender hierarchies. Her actions challenged societal assumptions about women's roles in both domestic and public spheres, demonstrating that leadership, intelligence, and courage are not confined by gender. Future female leaders and rebels, within and beyond Latin America, could draw inspiration from her example, understanding that resistance need not be dictated by societal expectations. Symbolically, the furnace itself became an enduring icon, Once a tool of oppression, it was transformed into a monument of liberation. Across plantations, enslaved people whispered about the furnace, associating it with courage, justice, and the triumph of intellect over tyranny. Esperanza's ability to convert a symbol of terror into a tool of moral retribution inspired generations to rethink how tools and environments of oppression could be subverted and repurposed. Finally, her legacy persisted because of the combination of strategy, morality, and psychological insight she demonstrated. Esperanza de Lima's rebellion was not a fleeting act of violence. It was a masterclass in resistance. Each component, observation, patience, alliance building, manipulation of fear, and precise execution, contributed to an outcome that would resonate for centuries. She left behind a template for how oppressed individuals could reclaim power in intelligent, moral, and transformative ways. In conclusion, the legacy of Esperanza de Lima is multifaceted. It is psychological, ethical, strategic, cultural, and symbolic. She shifted the balance of fear, inspired hope among the oppressed, and challenged historical assumptions about the agency of enslaved populations. Her story reminds future generations that rebellion need not be chaotic to be powerful, that courage must be paired with intelligence, and that justice, when executed with precision and morality, can transcend the immediate act and echo through history. Esperanza de Lima became not only a figure of vengeance, but a timeless emblem of human resilience, intellect, and moral courage. Esperanza de Lima's extraordinary rebellion against 14 of the most feared plantation owners in 1716 was more than a singular act of vengeance. It was a defining moment in the history of resistance against colonial slavery. While each of the previous 9 keynotes examined her planning, execution, and immediate impact, this final chapter focuses on the enduring significance of her actions and the ways in which her story has resonated through history, shaping narratives of courage, strategy, and moral justice. At its core, the impact of her actions was psychological as well as physical. The sudden disappearance of the 14 plantation owners shattered the aura of invulnerability that other planters relied upon to maintain control. Fear spread not only among the immediate circle of owners, but across surrounding plantations, destabilizing confidence and exposing vulnerabilities that had long been ignored. Plantation owners became increasingly cautious, their authority undermined by the knowledge that even carefully guarded estates could be infiltrated, and that rebellion could strike in unexpected ways. Esperanza's act became a cautionary tale, a lesson that no position of power, no matter how entrenched, was immune to calculated resistance. Her story also had profound implications for the enslaved and oppressed populations. Beyond the immediate physical liberation of herself and her allies, Esperanza provided a model of strategic and moral resistance. Her intelligence, patience, and ability to orchestrate a complex plan became lessons in empowerment. Oral histories passed down quietly over generations celebrated her courage and ingenuity. She became a symbol that survival did not require submission, that justice could be achieved through cleverness as much as brute strength, and that collective and coordinated efforts could topple even the most formidable oppressors. One of the most significant aspects of her legacy is the ethical precision of her actions. Unlike indiscriminate revolts, Esperanza's rebellion was targeted and morally guided. Innocents were spared, and the punishment was reserved strictly for those guilty of the most egregious crimes. This approach distinguished her from other acts of rebellion that were often characterized by chaos and generalized violence. It established a moral framework for resistance. Courage and intelligence must be paired with discernment and justice, ensuring that acts of rebellion carry not only power, but ethical clarity. Culturally, Esperanza de Lima challenged norms surrounding gender and race, as a woman orchestrating the downfall of 14 men who were socially, economically, and militarily dominant. She defied the expectations of her time. Her success subverted deeply ingrained ideas about women's roles in society and demonstrated that courage, leadership, and strategic genius were not bound by gender. Her actions provided inspiration for future female leaders, showing that women could exert influence and enact change even in rigidly patriarchal societies. The furnace itself became a powerful symbol in history. Once a mechanism of oppression, it was transformed into a tool of justice, Its flames, which had tormented countless enslaved people, were now harnessed to deliver judgment to the guilty. This transformation underscores a larger theme. Tools of tyranny can be repurposed by those who are intelligent and brave enough to seize them. The furnace, in essence, became both a literal and metaphorical instrument of liberation, embodying Esperanza's ingenuity and resilience. Esperanza's rebellion also influenced the formation and tactics of clandestine networks of resistance. Her use of coded communication, alliances, timing, and manipulation of fear became a template for later movements among enslaved populations and oppressed groups. These techniques emphasized strategy over sheer force, demonstrating that even small groups, when coordinated intelligently, could exert profound influence over the powerful. Esperanza's methodology continues to be studied in historical accounts of rebellion and resistance for its innovation and effectiveness. Her story reached beyond immediate geographical boundaries as well. Scholars, historians, and cultural commentators have revisited her actions as a case study in moral, strategic rebellion. She challenged stereotypes of the enslaved as passive or incapable of complex thought. Esperanza de Lima's name has been cited in discussions of leadership, courage, and ethical resistance, reinforcing her status not only as a historical figure of vengeance, but also as an enduring symbol of human ingenuity and moral clarity. Finally, her legacy endures because it embodies the triumph of intellect, courage, and moral vision over oppression. Esperanza de Lima's story teaches timeless lessons. That systems of cruelty can be dismantled, that careful planning can transform desperation into power, that fear can be redirected to topple tyrants, and that ethical judgment elevates acts of rebellion into historical milestones. Her life demonstrates that true courage is measured not only by action but by the foresight, discipline, and moral wisdom that guide it. In conclusion, Esperanza de Lima's rebellion against the 14 plantation owners of 1716 stands as one of history's most striking examples of calculated, ethical, and transformative resistance. Her story resonates through the centuries as a testament to the intelligence, courage, and moral resolve of the oppressed. She transformed personal suffering into a blueprint for liberation, turning fear into power, oppression into opportunity, and tyranny into a lesson for all who would seek justice. Esperanza de Lima remains not only a historical figure of vengeance but an enduring emblem of human resilience, strategic genius, and the pursuit of justice across generations.